Hi everyone, my name is Victoria Katainen, and I'd like to thank your lecturer, Dr. Claire Hansen, for the opportunity to come and speak to you today about postcolonialism and the environment. Because this is a literature subject, EL 3100, Green Worlds at JCU, I'm going to be thinking about that through the lens of literature. So as an important place to begin, I think it's important that we define our terms. Dr. Hansen's posed you a really interesting question, a topical one. How might post-colonial perspectives change how we understand our relationship to the environment? And today I'm going to give you some tools, I hope, to help you address that question. The first of which is going to be thinking about how we define post-colonialism, because post-colonialism, like the term romanticism, as the quote in the center of your screen suggests, is a word that has been defined in many ways, is deployed in lots of ways, and has found its way into our common lexicon as well. So it's important we kind of hammer down what it is that we're talking about when we're using the term in terms of post-colonial literary theory. Now, I've got a definition that we're going to use as a working definition here from the Norton Anthology of English Literature, from their introduction on page 25. And they say that post-colonialism is an interdisciplinary field, like ecocriticism, and it examines the impact, the global impact of European colonialism from its beginnings in the Age of Discovery in the 15th century up into the present. Now you will see that I have underlined up until the present, and the reason I have done that is because post-colonial critics are always the first to emphasize that post-colonialism isn't simply an historical event that is to do with anti-colonial nationalist movements in a moment in time when nations got their independence from a European colonizer. More than that, the effects of colonization happen immediately at impact, so as early as the Age of Discovery, and with continuity and some permutations all the way up into the present time. We are not recovered from the effects of colonialism just because instantaneously, by the stroke of a pen, a government structure that was set up for legal dominance has been dismissed with emancipation. That the effects of colonialism are a part of a problematic, and it's an aftermath that is long. So broadly speaking, postcolonialism aims to describe the mechanisms of colonial power, to recover excluded or marginalized subaltern voices, and to theorize the complexities of colonial and postcolonial identity, national belonging, and globalization. Moreover, the idea of place is central to postcolonial thinking and writing, which foregrounds the spatial imagination made possible by the experience of place. In postcolonial theory, place is foremost expressed through geography in terms that characterize the expansion of empire and its effects in geolocative nomenclature, such as those of the imperial center or the colonial periphery. It's also considered environmentally in terms of wilderness or urban settings, genealogically in terms of linking communal ancestry to land or heritage, and phenomenologically in the ways in which embodied experiences are linked to place. Now, just as there are many definitions of colonialism, there are many different kinds of colonialism too. Generally, there's a kind of a tripartite model that we use to characterize the general kinds of colonialism, and that is franchise colonialism, plantation colonialism, and settler colonialism. But some theorists expand that. Nancy Shoemaker, in an article from 2015 that you can find online called The Typology of Colonialism, expands into a few other categories, among which she names extractive colonialism, transport colonialism, and missionary colonialism, if you want to have a look at that article. But generally, those become more refined types of colonialism with under these three categories. And so franchise colonialism refers to that sort of first wave of colonialism that was set up in the 1600s, when at first in the era of First Empire, the VOC, which is the Dutch East Indian Trading Company, and then later in the era of Second Empire, the British East Indian Trading Company, developed outposts for trade. They were representatives of empire who were minorities rather than the majority population, and they conceived, at least initially, of their being overseas in India as only for the purposes of trade, not for living, that this was a temporary structure. Though, of course, under the British Raj, this became a more permanent structure until Indian independence. So franchise colonialism shifted into a kind of settler colonialism. Franchise colonialism is different from plantation colonialism. So franchise colonialism was usually to do with the trade of goods that were already being cultivated and exchanged in India. Whereas plantation colonialism was where land tracts were taken up by landholders of varying size for the purposes of harvest. And small numbers of European planters then established small to large scale cotton, tobacco, or sugar plantations, and they drew on slave or indentured labor, as in the Caribbean, which you may know as the West Indies. These planters retained strong links to homeland via regular exchange networks and trade. They did set up homes in the Caribbean. They often also maintained estates back in the UK. And this was slightly different than settler colonialism. So settler colonialism is the kind of colonization that characterizes Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Canada, and of course the USA as well, among other places. And it's different from franchise colonialism because here the colonizers came to stay. Invasion, as Patrick Wolf has put it in his 1999 article, is a structure in this case, not an event. It's a form of colonialism, he says, that seeks to replace the original population of the colonized territory with a new society of settlers. As with all forms of colonialism, it is based on exogenous domination, so domination from elsewhere, typically organized or supported by the imperial authority. And it can be enacted by a variety of means, ranging from violent depopulation, frontier wars, or legal means of appropriating of land and assimilation. Unlike other forms of colonialism, the imperial power does not always represent the same nationality as the settlers. And unlike plantation colonialism, the settlers become the majority rather than minority population. The colonizing authority believes the settlers are racially superior, even though they will over time begin to see settlers as an inferior strain of their so-called master race as well. So we're going to be, using some of those kinds of colonialism to think about what those different kinds of colonialism mean for different post-colonial engagements with place as well today. Okay, so let's move on. Now, certainly all of these forms of colonialism represent in varying degrees complex or blunt and instrumental domination of bodies, minds, and land, right? And in post-colonial literature, again, remembering that this is a literature course that we're in, we need to think about the role that language plays, not just as innocently apprehending a situation and describing it, but as a tool of conquest. And that's something that post-colonial literary scholars are very mindful of. In post-colonial literature, domination is understood in a priori terms as discursive. That means happening at the level of discourse, legal, management, governmental levels of describing things, writing about people, giving them subjectivity of various kinds or not. Discourse refers to language and thought in ways that carries material effects. And the reason why post-colonial literary theorists think of that this way is not just because we're fixated on literature, but because there's actually historical evidence of the way in which the Imperial British government deployed literature for colonizing effects. And scholars here quite often will point to Thomas Babington Macaulay's famous Macaulay's Minute that he tabled in the House of Parliament in England in 1835. He was the MP for Leeds in England, but he was also briefly the governor of India during the Raj era, when Britain had actually taken up a legal role of domination. Now, Macaulay, as you'll read here, said, "It is impossible for us with our limited means to attempt to educate the body of people." They were prolific. There were many of them, many more than there were the British who were in India. "We must at present do our best," he said, "to form a class who may be interpreters between us and the millions whom we govern, a class of persons Indian in blood and color, but English in taste and opinions and morals and intellect. And to that class we may leave it to refine the vernacular dialects of the country, to enrich those dialects with terms of science and culture borrowed from Western nomenclature." And now they were purposely trying to create a kind of civil servant class, an in-between intermediary class, and an English education was seen as central to that. The classics of English literature were deployed purposely as kind of weapons in this case to educate Indians to see through the eyes of the colonizer and to be indoctrinated with their values. And this kind of indoctrination happened all across the British Empire, where the school system played a really important role in making people, to use Foucault's terms, docile bodies of empire, docile subjects of empire. It wasn't until the emergence of proto-postcolonial theory in the 1950s and 60s in the work of theorists of subaltern identity like Frantz Fanon that this became something that theorists actually started to think about ways to overcome and address. So Frantz Fanon has been important for thinking through the ways in which the internalized values of language affect minorities, especially subjugated peoples of other races who learn to see themselves through the eyes of the language of the oppressor. Fanon's work affirmed, and I quote him, that it is through language that we see the world and ourselves through the colonizer's eyes. So literature's obviously played a key role in creating a vision of this world through the eyes of the colonizer and through education and the teaching of English literary texts as bearers of universal values, or so-called universal values that perpetuated empire and subjugation. Writers such as Rudyard Kipling, author of the poem The White Man's Burden, were often complicit as apologists of empire. Others, like James Granger, a Scottish doctor who settled on the West Indian island of St. Kitts in 1759 and managed his family's sugar plantation there, wrote pastoral poems about the land that described slavery and plantations without endorsement or critique. So you can have ambivalence to endorsement here. And sometimes a bit of both in the literature. Shakespeare, too, is not without criticism in this regard. In simplest terms, his play The Tempest serves up a fictional Caribbean island, thought by some scholars to be Bermuda, others perhaps Barbados, when the English were expanding into this region via the conquests of Sir Francis Drake. It is peopled by magical beasts of the island, Caliban, the Sycorax, straight out of the colonial book of the monstrous or the exotic. And Prospero himself is, of course, the European patriarch who attempts to restore order with the magic of his learning and his book, bringing the word, Enlightenment ideals. Now, of course, your lecturer, Dr. Claire Hansen, is an expert in Shakespeare and is probably going to give you a far more nuanced reading of that than I can offer here. But postcolonial literary theory has, however, also held out a long-standing belief in the significance of imaginative literature as a catalyst for social action, a view which sees language as having potential emancipatory powers, as well as the power to be wielded as a tool of conquest and oppression. So postcolonial literary theorists point to the role of literature both in the perpetuation of colonialist ideals, but also in the challenging of what Poco critic Edward Said refers to as cultural imperialism through postcolonial literature's emancipatory powers. So as we'll go on to consider, the job for students of ecocriticism is to think through what this means for writing about the environment, which can be a complex task and one that postcolonial critics like Graham Huggan and Helen Tiffin or Elizabeth DeLowry and others are only just beginning to do, although there's been a long-standing strain of postcolonial literary analysis since the 1980s that has focused on what postcolonialism means for writing about place, and so we will begin there. Some have argued that literature in English in the prose and poetic traditions is completely ill-suited to the colonial condition, and it's easy to see why. The language and metaphors of English literature and its poetic heritage are intimately tied to the English landscape. Let's take Wordsworth's famous lyric poem, I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud. And this is just, one stanza from it. I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high over vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils. It's got a very gentle, ululating sort of rhythm to it, like rolling hills, doesn't it? Now, it is Wordsworth's most famous poem, and it was inspired by an event in 1802 in which the poet and his sister Dorothy came across a long belt of daffodils on one of their walks that they often took in the Lake District of England. It was very much inspired by a particular landscape. And apparently it was an excerpt from his sister's journal describing this walk that inspired Wordsworth the most. The terms Dorothy uses in her journal entry of seed and spore also kind of pull in the metaphor of colony. A colony, of course, is a word that refers to ecosystem, has nature connotations with it, but also, a kind of a government structure. And interesting to think about how that word is used in two ways, one natural and one completely not, in ways that may suggest, the naturalization of colonialism in the thinking of the British at the time. I don't want to make too much of her word colony, but I do want to read what she has to say here, because what she has to say in the diary entry that inspired this poem is also very much of the same piece, a piece that is incredibly inspired by a very particular British landscape. She says, when we were in the woods beyond the park, we saw a few daffodils close to the waterside. We fancied that the lake had floated the seed ashore, and this little colony had so sprung up. But as we went along, there were more, and yet more, and at last, under the boughs of trees, we saw there was a long belt of them along the shore, about the breadth of a country road. I never saw daffodils so beautiful. They grew among the mossy stones about and about them. Some rested their heads upon these stones, as on a pillow for weariness. The rest tossed and reeled and danced, and seemed as if they laughed with the wind that blew upon them over the lake. They looked so gay, ever glancing and ever changing. This wind blew directly over the lake to them. There was here and there a little knot of a few stragglers a few yards higher up, but there were so few as not to disturb the simplicity and unity of life. On that one busy highway, we rested again and again. Now, that was written on the 15th of April, 1802. It's very much a spring-like pastoral scene, the kind of early spring. Daffodils are some of the first to appear in flowers. And so you'd only know that if you have lived in the Northern Hemisphere in a temperate zone like I have myself. Or, there are temperate zones in Australia as well, but it's not something you would probably know in the tropics. But these images are so ultimately lyrical and sublime, and William lifts them and mixes them also with the language of spiritualism. A host, a cloud of golden daffodils. They're given an aura, a halo. And so all of these metaphors sort of like, layering on top of one another. The colony, the spiritual metaphors, this idea of resting one's head upon a pillow for weariness, for example, the mossy stones. There's a lot of delicate and fragile nature personified, as if bending in supine worship to a transcendental God. And these images really only make sense if you've been to England or Europe, where the climate, like I said, is gentle in spring. But there's also a sense of ease in nature here, of leisured existence that affords the privilege to engage with nature in an aestheticized way. The open skies under which Wordsworth writes about the daffodils and nature tend to imply a writing subject who is lord over all that he surveys. And similarly, in classic English books like Jane Eyre, the landscape is often a wide panorama, an estate. And Bronte often uses the natural landscape as a metaphor for her protagonists' psychological and spiritual states too. There's a lot of personification and projection It's a landscape similarly peopled with people of privilege, salubrious walks and promenades, and its characters are set as if in European landscape portraits, composed with precise and delicate pen line in watercolors, subtle hues, where there are figures in a landscape, large panoramas in which this figure is central, or the built environment predominates, draped in dewy freshness. But as the critic Lauren Smith has argued in her article, Painting with Words, Natural and Spiritual Landscapes in Jane Eyre and Wide Sargasso Sea, the post-colonial writer Jean Rhys does not use the broad strokes of Bronte's grand panoramas or the gentle terms that Wordsworth used in his Lonely as a Cloud poem, but struggles through her art to find a Caribbean art form for landscape, using different metaphors, different activities, different ways of seeing and being and relating to place, not filtered through English ways of being or relating. As the author Aldous Huxley wrote in his 1929 essay, Wordsworth in the Tropics, "A voyage through the tropics," he says, would have cured Wordsworth of his too easy and comfortable pantheism. A few months in the jungle would have convinced him that the diversity and utter strangest of nature are at least as real and significant as his intellectually discovered unity. Huxley asserts that Wordsworth mistook the pastoral for the natural, forgetting that the sheep and countless miles of stone walls and mossy stones rolling over hill and dale are not nature, but nature tamed, nature recreated in man's own image. Man's own image, and man who is a very European in perspective and upper class in outlook. Huxley points out that there are other modes of nature than the classic English writer can apprehend, including nature's sinister, hostile, and terrifying aspect. Seminal works that write back to the classics of English literature have reimagined their worlds from the perspective of marginalized peoples, often represented by shadow characters in the central text. And these books often reimagine landscape too. So I've mentioned already the classic work of post-colonial Caribbean fiction by Jean Rhys, The Wide Sargasso Sea, that is a Caribbean-centered response to Jane Eyre, exploring the backstory of the Caribbean Creole. That's a white woman who's no longer really perceived as authentically racially white because she's been living in the colonies for so long, but she is white. She is a poor, she's seen as culturally poor but land rich, and Rochester marries her as his first wife. In fact, that's where he gets the money for his estate. Too bad she goes mad. And then he gets to marry Jane Eyre, and so it imagines the backstory. Why did she go mad? Maybe Rochester had something to do with it. That rich, dashing Englishman who comes promising all of the riches of the empire, but perhaps in reality, the experience of him is something else. Tayeb Salih's Season of Migration to the North is another such that enacts a kind of reversal or like a revision of Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. Heart of Darkness has received a lot of criticism from post-colonial critics because of the way it kind of uses the Congo and all of deepest, darkest Africa, and I say those things in quotation marks, as a projection of a modernist European mind losing its center. Or we have South African-born and Australian resident J.M. Coetzee's Foe, written from the perspective of an imagined female castaway who stumbles upon Robinson Crusoe and his slave Friday. Or there's Aimé César's Black Power version of Shakespeare's The Tempest, Une Tempête, with Caliban playing a revolutionary black intellectual. Now, it's not just that these take characters, marginal characters, and write back from their perspective, but these books often try to render a perspective that is, based in the landscape of the colonial milieu, often from that colonial or indigenous perspective too. And so post-colonial eco-critics consider environmental issues as part of a larger set of problems resulting from imperialism, including racial oppression, and these books address all of those things. Now, in this lecture, I'm not going to be focusing on those books. I welcome you to take up EL 3050 next year in first semester when we're going to be offering post-colonial literature. if you're interested in doing more of a deep dive than this superficial wading around in the shallows today, if you'll forgive the landscape metaphor. But in this lecture, I really just kind of want to spend a bit of time thinking about the role of language in apprehending and describing landscape before going to some of the problems and affordances of a post-colonial approach to eco-criticism. Now, one of the first things that we need to recognize is that post-colonial literature in Africa, the Caribbean, India, settler colonies, and more far-flung than that, is of course in profound dialogue with landscape and place, but in a problematic way because of language. And one of the first problems is that language, the language often used to express these places is English. And English is a storehouse of vocabulary and metaphor and thought constructs that come from elsewhere, but through which the colonial land is described. Even the term landscape, for instance, suggests a very European perspective coming from, etymologically, from 16th century Dutch painters, landschap, denoting a picture of scenery, which is obviously not the only way to be in relation to land. As D.E.S. Maxwell has written in his classic essay of post-colonial literary theory, Landscape and Theme, the societies produced by the various histories of colonization furnish the writer, the novelist especially, with his subjects. The variety of the histories is further complicated for the writer by the relationship between his environment and the language he uses. In one circumstance, the writer brings an alien language, English, to his own social and cultural inheritance, like in India or West Africa. And I've given you, the work of Kenyan writer Chinua Achebe, Things Fall Apart here, classic work of post-colonial Kenyan literature written in the 1950s, and Ngugi wa Thiong'o. You can see this is in his native dialect. Now, so there are cases of, where Chinua Achebe has chosen to write in English, where he brings an alien language, English, to his own cultural and social inheritance. His people are from that land of which he writes. The other circumstance D.E.S. Maxwell talks about is when the writer brings his own language, English, to an alien environment and a fresh set of experiences. And by that, of course, we're thinking about a planter or a settler colonial. But as a result of colonialism, of course, the English language has been established throughout the world as a language of trade and government, and of course, as we've already implied, education. And this colonial inheritance has left its mark almost everywhere: Africa, Caribbean, Asia, Pacific Island, and Indian Ocean societies formerly colonized by England. And this is not to mention, of course, French or German or Dutch that were established in societies formerly colonized by those imperial powers too. Now, the fact that English is used still produces a measure of anxiety throughout the post-colonial world, particularly in expressive arts, though most African and Asian countries embrace English language education as the language of international commerce. Of course, there is this idea of the way in which the English language education inculcates English values as well. Now, aside from the fact that English is seen by some as an opposed language, the lingering problem is that in many cases, writers who use English in Asia or Africa are using a language different from the one most likely spoken by their main characters, and different, of course, from the language their original relations to land were expressed in. In the case of African post-colonial writers, this is a particularly acute issue as the continent is vast and linguistically as well as ethnically diverse. There are more than 2,000 distinct languages in Africa and more than 3,000 distinct ethnic groups. The introduction of the colonial languages thus enables Africans to communicate with each other as well as to a wider audience beyond Africa. But the notion of nation in these contexts, as well as national literature, is fraught, since the nation itself is a creature of colonialism, as we will begin to think through the resonances of momentarily. 3,000 distinct ethnic groups channeled into 44 colonial countries does not make for an easy situation, even for a writer who has not technically been displaced from the land of their forebears. Now, while some post-colonial African creative writers like Kenyan author Ngugi wa Thiong'o have renounced writing in language of the colonizer, English, and argued for a return to writing in indigenous African languages, others like Chinua Achebe continue to write in English, the language of trade and education for many Africans, at least in part to reach a wider audience. Now, Achebe puts it this way: for an African, writing in English is not without its serious setbacks. He often finds himself describing situations or modes of thought which have no direct equivalent in the English way of life. Caught in that situation, he can do one of two things. He can try and contain what he wants to say within the limits of conventional English, or he can try to push back those limits to accommodate his ideas. I submit that those who can do the work of extending the frontiers of English so as to accommodate African thought patterns must do it through their mastery of English and not out of innocence. So he's saying, there needs to be a really mindful operation at work for a post-colonial writer writing in English. He's trying to remake the English language so that it'll contain, natural thought structures and ways of expressing, land and the subjective experiences of characters. But it's not easy, in particular because we need to be mindful that these characters have been educated in English from a very young age as well. Now, Achebe submits that writing in English is a way of pushing the frontiers of the master's language and introducing hybridity to the English language. But the apprehension of place in English not only introduces a colonial form, the English novel, but also presents interesting challenges for the way the apprehension of place might be radically different than the aestheticized place of an English writer writing in canonical English language or literature. In the case of the Caribbean, or you may know the region as the West Indies, writers such as St. Lucian poet Derek Walcott and Barbadian novelist George Lamming have a situation that slightly complicates Maxwell's tidy binary, where the writer in one instance brings an alien language, English, to his own place, or in another instance brings his own language, English, to an alien environment. For the West Indian Caribbean writer, there is no choice but to write in English because there is no originary language in the case of the Black slave diaspora that forms 98% of the population in that region. But these writers have also consciously adapted hybrid forms of English literature. Omeros, in fact, actually it was a Nobel Prize-winning epic poem that consciously responds to a classic forebear even further back, Homer's Iliad. And Lamming's coming-of-age castle is a clear hybrid form, interweaving the dense imagery and syntax of high modernist English with Bajan, Barbadian slang, and local incidents. As the Caribbean has been formed by the matrix of plantation colonialism, there is no outside of the colonial way of being in this place, no access to a pre-contact way of life. In Castle, slaves have been brought to till the land and harvest, and there is a sense in this landscape, in the Castle of My Skin, of a highly oppressive sense of being in place, where there is no idyllic or aestheticized sense of landscape, but place is felt and it's claustrophobic. It is not until the main character of this novel, G, who is a loosely autobiographical cipher for George Lamming himself, leaves his island home of Barbados, that he sees it with different eyes. And the register of the pastoral and even the elegy, a love for something passing, perhaps even the dying days of the aftermath of slavery under British rule, comes to encode the ways that he writes land. Now, Nonetheless, I think that one of Maxwell's observations is very keenly true of his broad categories: English as a foreign language in a native home, or English as a native language in a foreign place. He goes on to say, these categories have a fundamental kinship. That means they're more alike than you might think they are. Viewing his society, Maxwell goes on to say, and this is an old article, so he says his society for the writer, but he means his or her society, or their society. Viewing their society, the writer constantly faces the evidences of the impact between what is native to it and what is derived from association with British culture. The Nigerian will respond differently to it from the Canadian. Both, however, are responding to circumstances which, for all their dissimilarities, share things, such as an attachment, whether voluntary or involuntary, at the start, to a remote society or culture, which is manifesting itself in their immediate surroundings. Now, I think what I like about this is it really takes into consideration the fact that, even for a writer like Chinua Achebe or Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who's writing in his native language, they are still going to be inculcated with English values. They have been colonized. They have been raised and educated within an English school system. And Lamming makes that a really explicit part of his book. It's a coming-of-age novel, so a lot of it is about schooling, and schooling set out in the way that Paulo Freire, that the famous theorist who thinks about the role of colonialism in the formation of a particular kind of education in a colonial domain does. So the schooling is often a large part of the novels, particularly novels about coming of age. You may have seen a movie recently on, I think it's recently become available on Netflix, Mr. Pip, which is written by I believe, Kiwi novelist, Lloyd Jones. He may be Australian, correct me if I'm wrong. And Mr. Pip is a novel that's set in Papua New Guinea in the aftermath of some anti-colonial violence that occurred, skirmishing over mining rights. And it also has a large part that's set in school and thinks about what it means for subjects to, for students to learn a European perspective, which he renders in some ways emancipating from a very restrictive colonial or anti-colonial regime, but is not without its problems as well, that the character in that coming-of-age novel begins to realize. I recommend you have a look at that movie if you get a chance while it's still on Netflix. Now, what I think what Maxwell says that I think is important is he says that this influence of the British perspective is not a writer's sole or even conscious preoccupation, but whatever his subject, the history of which it is a part must inevitably leave its characteristic trace. So in the settler colonial domain, writers have articulated that they've also felt kind of burdened by English in similar but distinct ways from writers such as Ngugi wa Thiong'o or Achebe. As Canadian writer Dennis Lee writes about articulating land and landscape in an authentic way, as a poet, place has a cadence, and this can be a problem if, as he says, we live in a space that is radically in question for us, that makes even the barest speaking a problem to itself. He goes on to say, my sense when I began writing in about 1960, and this lasted for 5 or 6 years, was that I had access to a great many words, those of British, the American, and so far as anyone took it seriously, the Canadian traditions. Now he's saying, just like Australia has its set of slang, Canada has its set of slang words, Canuck, okie dokie, roof, those sorts of things. And, they're often subjects of derisive humor, right? Targets of humor. But, so there's really not any kind of native English language. He's recognizing as he's coming to writing that he has inherited a palette of metaphors that come from elsewhere. And he said there was lots of them, but they seemed to lie in a great random heap that glittered with promise so long as I considered it in the mass, but which each individual word went stiff, inert, was somehow clogged with sludge the moment I tried to move it into place in a poem. I could stir words, prod at them, cram them into position, but there was no way I could speak them directly. The words, he says, I knew said Britain, and they said America, but they did not say my home. They were always and only about someone else's life. All the rich structures of language were present, but the currents that animated them were not home to the people who used the language there. I think that's really poignant. And it's an observation that cultural theorist Paul Carter, an Australian cultural theorist, has also made, and he's looked at the work of some of the early explorer journals and looked at how their journals are completely fraught with these problems of naming and describing place, as well as you see in this little epigram from Field. He's saying I had all these words to describe season and all these lyrical metaphors to talk about spring or summer, and it wasn't apropos in this place. I had no fellowship with Australian foliage. He finds it really hard to even relate to the landscape, having no language structure or vocabulary of sentiment to identify, to appeal to it. And Carter goes on to talk about how European nature, as described by European writers, doesn't really work in Australia. Carter talks about colonists' European place names in the Antipodes as well, like the King's Tableland, the Prince Regent's Glen, names borrowed from English places. And he goes on to look at journals of explorers of the Flinders Ranges who could only say what things were not. It was not quite like a meadow nor a swamp, rather than describe in English what they were seeing. I want to expand from this to think about how the colonial writer is dealing with a mixed inheritance then, and how this impacts the way they write about place, and how that impacts them, both the native subject and the settler subject, all forms of colonialism. One of the key teachings of postcolonial literary theory is the way in which the colonial experience is inherently hybridizing. Many agents of empire were regarded as representatives of England, as I suggested before, but their transplantation to the colony put them in an out-of-sorts position. And as Alan Lawson has written, this betwixt and between condition of colonialism can be particularly seen where distance from the imperial center is not just geographical and geographically extreme, as in Australia, but also exacerbated by years of dislocation. As in the case of Bertha, right? In Jean Race's Wide Sargasso Sea, she has her having lived multiple generations in the Caribbean as a Caribbean white, displaced from the imperial center. And the term Creole refers to a Caribbean white woman, but it has racial connotations because it's like, you're not legitimately English either. You're betwixt and between. So that book is a really interesting study of the relationships between the white Creole settler who becomes impoverished and the black former slaves, and how they need each other and appraise one another, judge one another, and their very complicated relationships. Now, as Lawson says, settlers are often regarded as illegitimate subjects, not only by the indigenous people their occupation has supplanted, but also by the imperial center, which regards them as imperfect specimens of the so-called master imperial race, drab colonials. They occupy what Lawson has called a complex set of difficult relations to history, heritage, genealogy, and home, and as well, of course, to place. Their relations to their adopted homeland are strained, and as is obviously their uneasy relationship to the indigenous people they have displaced by their settlement. So Lawson points out that settler colonial writing is consequently characterized by ambivalence to both the adopted homeland of Australia, for example, and their heritage of European descent. And this ambivalence is shot through in Australian writer A.D. Hope's famous poem, Australia, which he wrote in 1955, years when, Australia was really just emerging to pen its own literature in English. Now, here in this poem, we have remnants of the colonial exoticism of landscape that you might recognize from the Romantic poet Percy Shelley's Ozymandias, which was the Greek name for Egypt, and his 1818 poem that pondered the lost majesty of the pharaohs in the aftermath of Napoleon's Egyptian campaign. So there's a lot of sort of exoticization of the ancient land in a poem like that. And A.D. Hope imposes this idea of an ancient land as a sort of an exhausted land on the desert landscape of Australia. But it's obvious that he evidently evacuates the desert of any indigenous peoples as well. So he calls it, a young land as well, but a paradoxical one, the last of lands and the emptiest. Emptiest not only of, a small European population that at that time of writing would have been about, I believe, between 7 and 8 million, but he's eviscerating it of any trace of indigenous heritage or subjectivity. A nation of trees, drab green and desolate gray, and the field uniform of modern wars. These are people who've gone through 2 wars already. So he's describing this landscape, that drab green, army green, but also invoking, embattlement straight away. This is not a pastoral poem. Now this drab, gray, desolate, lonely, right? In the field uniform of modern wars, darkens her hills, those endless outstretched paws of sphinx demolished or stone lion worn away. So ancient but exhausted, worn away. They call her a young country, but lie. She is the last of lands, the emptiest, a woman beyond her change of life, a breast still tender, but within the womb is dry. Ooh, we're getting some nice little misogyny in there as well, right? And this is, again, the paradox, this ancient woman, but she hasn't been able to give birth to anything worthwhile. Without songs, architecture, history. It's very disparaging of any attempt to produce culture that the settler colonial population has attempted to create. The emotions and superstitions of younger lands, it's seeing it as a very immature colonial place. Her rivers of water drown among inland sands. The river of her immense stupidity floods her monotonous tribes from Cairns to Perth. In them, at last, the ultimate men arrive, whose boast is not, we live, but we survive, a type who will inhabit the dying earth. And her 5 cities, like 5 teeming sores, each drains her, a vast parasite robber state, where second-hand Europeans pullulate timidly on the edge of alien shores. Yet there are some like me turn gladly home from the lush jungle of modern thought to find the Arabian desert of the human mind, hoping, if still from the deserts the prophets come, such savage and scarlet as no green hills dare, springs in that waste. Some spirit which escapes the learned doubt, the chatter of cultured apes, which is called civilization over there. I don't know if you can hear how disparaging it is of so-called civilization over there as well, where there are chatterings of apes. So it's saying, that England, the imperial center, isn't so great after all either. It's refusing to name England as well, certainly not calling it home. It is the country that shall not be named, filled with the chatter of culture apes. But, even though the last 2 stanzas doesn't name them, there's this odd fetishizing of the indigenous, the displaced people who, as Alan Lawson says, the settler colonial cannot admit he's displaced, but also wishes to completely appropriate, to get as close to being as to replace. And this idea of the savage and the scarlet, from the desert the prophets come, he has to transpose an Eastern idea of the learned sage, the Middle Eastern guru onto this landscape, because he cannot admit an acknowledgement of any kind of indigeneity, would call the legitimacy of his settlement into doubt. Now, I see some hints of kind of imperialist nostalgia in this poem as well, and that's something I think that we need to probably address in this lecture, and in any kind of ecocriticism that thinks about things from the imperialist perspective as well. Ultimately, colonialism becomes a hybridized form of culture, and post-colonialism tries to work through the aftermath of the injustices and inequities that colonialism leaves in its wake well into the post-colonial present. But there is no pure pre-contact Edenic nature or peoples available to a colonized civilization. So even in ambivalently anti-colonial poems such as 80 Hopes, Australia, I think we can see a longing for a pristine beauty he associates with ancient Australia, which he sort of imagines as dying. But that is a form of imperialist nostalgia too. And it's something that good post-colonial writing always needs to be cautious of. It's a strange pitfall of the colonist that has been documented by the anthropologist Renato Rosaldo, which is a form of colonialism that mourns that which the very act of colonialism has destroyed. And I've just given you a link to the article there on JSTOR if you want to read it or quote from it. You can look it up on one search in the library. I'll link you to. It's a classic of post-colonial theory. You will have seen it, quoted thousands of times. Imperialist nostalgia bemoans the fact that a culture, a form of life, or an environment, or a species has become or is about to become extinct. And as Rosaldo writes, it's the perpetrator who laments. And it can be a slippery way that the colonizer seeks to sympathize with the native, align himself on the side of the goody, the victimized of colonization, as a strategy for innocence, one that seeks to cover up any kind of complicity with the imperial project. And this has consequences for the way in which post-colonial settlers and indigenes relate to the environment as well. Rosaldo emphasizes the inherent contradictions of this mood. Quote, he says, imperialist nostalgia revolves around a paradox. A person kills somebody and then mourns the victim. In a more attenuated form, someone deliberately alters a form of life and then regrets that things have not remained as they were prior to the intervention. At one more remove, people destroy their environment and then they worship nature, he says. The impulse to enshrine a pristine pre-contact environment is perhaps in this way more aligned with the visions of the aestheticizing writers of the environment, such as the English Romantic poets, than the writers who had no philosophical place of refuge, descendants of slaves, for example, such as George Lamming. Now, another point for caution is the way in which national literature itself can become caught up with the dynamics of colonization, particularly in the way it can place the writer in the position of bard to hail the spirit of a place, as if a writer has some sort of supernatural power to express the consciousness of a race. Terms like race we need to take with huge caution in post-colonial theory, but of course we need to remember that nations themselves are post-colonial constructs. Romantic theories of literature as the expression not merely of individual genius, but of the genius of a nation or a race, posit that the essential spirit or character of a people can be, expressed by assumption in the very notion of national literature. But as we noticed earlier when we were talking about Africa and the way in which colonization molded 3,000 distinct people groups into 2,000 language groups and then 44 national polities, which persist by and large beyond the political emancipation from the colonizing state, the idea of the nation is inherently fraught in the post-colonial milieu. And so the idea that literature has an exalted role above any other arts to express the soil of this place, can become incredibly fraught, even as this is exactly and explicitly what some of the earliest advocates of cultural nationalism in Australian literature did hope for, such as Nettie Palmer. Yet this is very much an invention of a tradition grafted on onto some of the key themes of Romanticism that from its earliest stirrings focused on, the development of national languages and folklore, spiritual values of traditions, but in a settler place, is quite different. So in this role, writers are placed in a bardic relationship to place and often read or hailed into structures that read them as voices of the nation. But poets like Anya Walkwitz, who is Polish-Australian, refuse that romantic tradition, rather than speechlessness like Canadian writers such as Dennis Lee. Woolwich's poem fills the page with prolixity, lots of words, babble, that writes back to an exclusionary nationalism and refuses to wait its turn to be acknowledged in the line of great Australian poems. It doesn't speak from the place or of the place, but to it, to an exclusionary Australia, penned entirely in terms of what an Anglo-Australian culture looks like to an outsider. And it doesn't naturalize that culture either. It calls it for how it sees it as a construct that persists in its ambivalent colonialism that A.D. Hope described in 1955. This poem refuses the easy relationship between nationalism and literature, refuses the role of the romantic nationalist, and it in itself can be seen as a kind of post-colonial move. But here it's important, I think, to recognize that even as the idea of the romantic nationalist voice of the land writer in a post-colonial milieu is imbued with colonialist nationalism, that even the romantic tradition was critical of empire. As Karen O'Brien has argued, a long poetic tradition beginning as far back as Milton and stretching well into the Romantic period and beyond, took opposition to empire as central to its imagination. Major poets of the English canon articulated a powerfully anti-imperial vision of the world, playing an important role in the public contestation of Britain's changing place in, world power. But then, as in now, in the age of neoliberalism, there were writers who played a really important advocacy role in breaking through to public consciousness with a heightened sense of political urgency that took a position of strident opposition to British Empire and made opposition to the British Empire conceivable and iterable, as O'Brien puts it. So even the idea of the classic English canon is therefore a complicated, entangled object full of its own contradictions. Moreover, as Graham Huggan has pointed out, there's a long critical tradition linking romantic writing with ecological writing. In the article that was recommended for this week, he says, Romanticism at large is imbricated with some of the central tenets of ecology. For instance, the notions of interdependence and intersubjectivity. With the idea, though of course one persistently disputed, both within romantic and ecological movements, of an organic connection to and continuum with the natural world. Furthermore, not all romantic poetry holds up the examples afforded by Wordsworth's Daffodils of the stereotypical romantic escape to nature. Huggan moderates an easy resurrection of romantic poets as green warriors, though adding that regular complaints continue to be made about romanticism as elitism, Eurocentrism, and regressivism. Nonetheless, he says the consensus view seems to be that a reappraisal rather than a mute acceptance or premature dismissal might be best suited to understanding the impact of romantic legacies on green thinking in the modern globalized world. If post-colonial literature then is left with no purely oppressive mouthpiece of empire in the form of literature to critique, though of course there are some, as in the case of Rudyard Kipling, I think it's important to recognize this may be one of the most important legacies of post-colonial literature, its embrace of the hybrid. Or the polyglot. It's recognition of Nicholas Thomas, what Nicholas Thomas has called the entanglements of empire. This is to recognize that colonialism, as Huggan points out in the recommended article this week, has a legacy of large-scale environmental destruction on the one hand, but also was responsible for the birth of the conservation movement. But if Romanticism cannot retreat to an idea of a pure, unsullied nature, Neither can postcolonialism. And here we need to remember with Renato Rosaldo that pure alterity is the fantasy that always already haunts the specter of imperialism. Just as Romanticism set up the notion of the exotic noble savage, so too is postcolonialism haunted by the idealization of the native other and the insistence that the other offers some pure access to an environment that is clear of the destruction, settlement, and extractive capitalism and overfarming has wrought. As I prepare to close today, I want to reflect on some insights from one of our most recent and important postcolonial indigenous writers, Alexis Wright. Rather than seeing writing as a national subject or writing national literature, Alexis Wright writes very specifically from her home country in the Gulf of Carpentaria and in the north of Australia. Characters in her novels, which are mouthpieces of nationalism, are targets of pejorative satire and negative portraiture. And these targets in Wright's literary imaginings can be Indigenous leaders themselves, such as Warren Finch in the Swan Book, whom she imagines as complicit with Australian nationalism, the prophesied first Aboriginal president of the Republic of Australia. In Alexis Wright's work, there's no pure environment or pure subjectivity into which to retreat. Her landscapes are filled with hurt people and polluted environments. Carpentaria is set in a dump. Swan Book is set in a swamp. Both are dystopian, mournful, epic novels expressing deep hurt in the land, but never hesitating to push back against the trope of Aborigine as noble savage or the fantasy of an indigenous Arcadia. Instead, building a world of bricolage and never hesitant to recycle the best of all world cultures, borrowing from European fairy tale, from Milan Kundero's magic realism, from indigenous dreaming as well. In Carpentaria, as it says on the slide, Angel Day says to, all she had to do was walk across the road to the rubbish dump, and there she could get anything her heart desired for free. She thought the dump was magnificent, as anyone dirt poor would. She ended up with an igloo made of rubbish. Alexis Wright said of her first novel, Plains of Promise, that she really rejected it because she felt she was writing in a very, Anglo-Australian sort of way. I have to wonder if Angel Day is a kind of proxy for the author herself here, that, she didn't realize she was poor. She had all this junk at her disposal, and this kind of renders the Aboriginal writer in a particular kind of polyglot position as well. It doesn't avail that noble savage kind of critique. All of these are lessons to take, I think, a more pragmatic view on what postcolonial literature and cultural theory offers to perspectives on the environment. So as tentative answers to Dr. Hansen's great question for this week, I offer 4 thoughts. Number 1, postcolonialism has taught us the importance of expanding the canon to include other voices that contest a narrowly Anglo-centric view of place and the world, critical perspectives such as the Indigenous perspective and the voices of the global South that are clearly important to heed. Number 2, postcolonial literature plays an advocacy function. It sees the role of the imagination and of cultural understanding as emancipatory, though it is always on the lookout for blind cul-de-sacs, for the post-colonial reversals, such as the violence of anti-colonial nationalism that can still haunt the ways we read and write. It cautions us to look instead for the local, for the humble, for the provisional, to be averse of grand theories, grand unifying theories and statements. And it's probably cautious of ideology in and of itself. Post-colonial literature reminds us of the ineluctable fact of hybridity in the aftermath of colonialism. This is my 3rd point. The case of African writers educated in writing in English to seek an audience for their advocacy literature is a case in point. This has impacts for the way in which writing has no access to a world of pure, unadulterated, pre-colonial alterity or Arcadian nature. Number 4, and this might be a problem for ecocriticism, post-colonial literature puts human justice first. Remembering the critiques of the relative economic privilege of writers such as William Wordsworth to imagine England as a garden of delight, it urges us to make accommodations for putting first the well-being of impoverished peoples worldwide. who need advocacy for their rights or need to be heard in terms of their own advocacy, rather than green campaigning that puts their livelihood and needs second in ways that speak from a place of first world privilege. Finally, and I think this leads you forward to next week, Alexis Wright's The Swan book places the animal, the swan, and its dreaming at the center of the novel, a creature imported from Europe in an era of a climate emergency. And this, too, is a shift in recent post-colonial writing that shares something with new nature writing. Huggan and Tiffin document this trend, which shares features with other post-colonial animal-centric novels like Jan Martel's The Life of Pi, Barbara Gowdy's The White Bone, and J.M. Coetzee's The Lives of Animals, to reflect on ways it urges a new writing practice. And they call it zoocriticism. They say it offers critical post-human perspectives. The question is, how do these align with human social justice and poverty? So this might be something that you might look at in your final week of Green Worlds. So thanks, Team Green, and many thanks to your lecturer, Dr. Claire Hansen, for inviting this talk today. I hope you've gleaned something from it, if nothing else, that there are no easy answers. And also that it's introduced you to some novelists and writers that I've mentioned that you may go on and explore yourself. I just wanted to remind you that next semester in SB1 2021, we will be offering post-colonial narratives. The subject code for that is EL3050, and I hope to see some of you there. Thanks, everyone, and best wishes with your semester.